Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Representative Min for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. So first question for you all. How many of you have taken an economics introductory class? Can you raise your hand if you have? Okay, let the record reflect all 4 raised their hands. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar and remember the concept of negative externalities or negative external costs? Only Ms. Howell's raising her hand. Mr. Tarpley looked like he was about to. Okay, just as a refresher, you may remember from Econ 101, negative externalities describe the indirect or hidden negative costs sometimes created by an economic transaction. The classic example, of course, is downstream pollution, where a factory discharges its waste into a river, which in turn creates unclean water that leads to cancer, health issues, maybe disrupts the fishing industry downstream. The negative costs of this pollution are not paid for by the factory or its consumers, but are instead costs that society bears. We might call them hidden costs. Now, offshore drilling is another textbook example of an economic activity that produces large negative externalities or hidden costs. This is not a disputed point. As we all know, burning fossil fuels releases large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, which has created a climate crisis that we are just beginning to wrap our heads around. According to the IMF, when you factor in these hidden costs related to carbon emissions, oil production costs our society over $7 trillion a year. We're seeing these costs accrue in the form of extreme temperatures across the world, including the 140-degree temperatures we saw in India last year, biblical-level disasters like wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, extreme drought and flooding, and the like. And here is the thing. In 100 years, when people look back at this time, they're going to say that the 2020s were uniquely benign, uniquely cool as far as our weather patterns. Our grandkids and great-grandkids are going to look back and say that these were the good old days. We are literally damning them to hell on Earth unless we aggressively reduce our carbon emissions. The negative external costs of oil production are so large as to potentially be an existential threat to our civilization. Offshore drilling also produces other major hidden costs, which I want to briefly address. First, the threat of oil spills, which have been a recurring problem for California's coastlines over the years. In 2021, my district experienced a major oil spill off the coast of Huntington, which shut down our local coastal economy and brought outdoor recreation and tourism to a halt. And we dodged a bullet as this was a small spill of only 25,000 gallons. But here is the problem. It's increasingly becoming clear that, at least in California, the economics of offshore drilling mean it's a matter of when, not if, we will have additional oil spills. The oil rigs off our coast were built between the 1960s and 80s and are long past their shelf life. Production is in decline, and the original leaseholders have all long since sold off their leases to small wildcat companies, which have no incentive to invest meaningfully in safety and soundness. To put it simply, offshore drilling has become a ticking time bomb for our coastline. So, Mr. Tarpley, would you be surprised if I told you that California's coastal economy, our beautiful beaches and tourism and innovation that we generate, is quite valuable? Yes or no?
Yes.
You would be surprised? Okay.
I understand how valuable it is.
It produces $1.7 trillion a year in value, according to NOAA. Mr. Tarpley, I guess I'll just ask you again, would you be surprised if I told you that oil drilling off the coast of California is very minuscule by comparison?
That's correct.
That's right. Offshore oil drilling near California generates less than 0.006% of the value generated by our coastal economy. So I will just ask Ms. Howell, I'll switch to you. Do you think that the potential risks to California's coastal economy are justified by the tiny amount of oil being produced there?
No, absolutely. There's no reason, sorry.
Now, another major hidden cost associated with offshore drilling is decommissioning costs, which I really haven't heard addressed too much here. But once these wells run dry, you have to plug them so they don't leak, dismantle the infrastructure so they don't create long-term problems. This costs a lot of money. Today, over 78% of the 2,000-plus leases in U.S. waters or outside of U.S. waters are currently idle, which means the associated oil rigs are abandoned and need decommissioning. But instead of actually paying for these costs, all too often, oil companies abandon these obligations and declare bankruptcy. In the last 15 years, there have been more than 30 Chapter 11 bankruptcies of offshore operators, leaving U.S. taxpayers with $7.5 billion in liabilities. It's estimated that we have another $40 to $70 billion in further cleanup costs remaining, and these are paid for by the taxpayers. Is that not correct, Ms. Howell?
That's absolutely correct.
So I want to just close with this. You may remember that last May, Donald Trump, now the president, held a meeting with oil executives where he promised to slash environmental protections if the oil industry contributed $1 billion to his campaign. Perhaps coincidentally, in the months following, oil executives donated hundreds of million dollars to his campaign, as well as the campaign of many other Republicans campaigning on slashing our environmental regulations. This is the first hearing this committee is holding since that time. And I guess my question is, when you think about the merits, whatever you think about the merits of offshore drilling, do you think, and I'll ask this to Ms. Howell, that Americans might reasonably see this hearing as a form of corruption where House Republicans are delivering on the pay-to-play promise that Donald Trump made last year to the oil industry?
Absolutely. The premise that we are.
I would request a point of order. I would request that the gentleman's words be taken down. I think
on what
he is
basis?
I think that he has maligned every single person on this side of the aisle
I'm
in terms of
I'm
the
asking the
hearing.
witness if this
You
is a
have
reasonable
indicated
question.
that we are engaging in corruption.
No, I said,
Mr.
is it reasonable for
Mr.
Americans
Chairman,
to believe that,
the
based on
gentleman,
the things that we
may I
all read in the
speak?
newspapers?
The chair will
speak?
take a moment to consider.
Thank you.
The chair, after conferring, we're going to, at the moment, allow them to stand. We are going to review, those are the exact language.
Should she be allowed to answer the question? I asked her if it would be reasonable for people to assume that, the American people to assume that, or believe that.
We're out of time right now. If somebody yields your time, Mr. Min, you can do
Thank
that.
you. I yield back.
But we're going to review and make that determination as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Representative Hageman from Wyoming for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that the question at the beginning of the last set of questions was whether any of you had any economic background. My question for you is, do any of you understand the concept of opportunity costs?
Yes.
Okay, it's an important concept, isn't it?
Yes, it
I wish that the folks on the other side understood the concept of opportunity costs. I also wish that they understood the concept of energy poverty, because it is the policies that they
Point
have
of
been
order.
pushing
She's
forward.
suggesting that we don't understand the concept, and I would just rebut that. I think she's maligning our side here. I actually do understand the concept of opportunity costs.
Overruled.
The Port of Fourchon, Mr. Chiason, did I say that correctly?
Chasson, but that's.
All right. The Port of Fourchon plays a critical role in offshore energy production, supporting a vast network of workers and suppliers across the country, including in Wyoming. Wyoming-based companies manufacture equipment and provide services that support offshore oil and gas operations, but restrictions on leasing impact supply chains beyond just the Gulf Coast. Gulf energy revenues benefit states throughout GOMESA, but Wyoming receives no similar revenue sharing from energy production on federal lands. Should Congress revisit how energy-producing states are compensated for leasing on federal lands and waters?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I do believe we need to re-look at revenue sharing.
Okay, and Mr. Wilson, Wyoming's natural gas industry is closely tied to Gulf Coast export facilities, which rely on a steady offshore oil and gas production. The Biden administration's regulatory delays for offshore leasing mirror policies restricting drilling on federal lands in Wyoming, raising concerns about a broader trend of federal overreach in U.S. energy policy. Wyoming's natural gas pipelines interconnect with Gulf LNG facilities. If offshore production is restricted, what impact would that have on Wyoming's ability to move natural gas to export markets?
Well, the natural gas market's a global market. It's also a national market. So any restrictions in any areas on natural land are going to impact other areas of production.
So it will have an impact on Wyoming if they shut off
I
the
think it'll
coast.
have an impact on all portions of the natural gas industry, yes.
From a legal perspective, do you see a coordinated effort by federal agencies to curtail U.S. energy production across multiple sectors?
I mean, what I can tell you is that over the last 4 years, we've seen more difficulty in acquiring permits. In the small E&P production that we do have, we've seen more difficulty in acquiring federal permits, although I will say that FERC is operating in a very efficient manner right now and has been for the last couple of years, but generally, yes.
Mr. Tarpley, restrictions on offshore leasing impact workforce mobility and job opportunities. Wyoming is rich in critical minerals and rare earth elements, which are essential for offshore drilling technologies. Federal leasing delays could disrupt domestic supply chains for these minerals. Offshore drilling requires specialized metals and components, some of which are sourced from Wyoming's mining industry. Have federal leasing delays impacted demand for domestically sourced critical minerals, pushing such production overseas?
I certainly think that regulatory slowdown and delays has affected demand, and it's also affected the workforce and everything throughout the supply chain, so yes.
So one of the things that has been very critically important that I have watched over the last 4 years relates to the idea, again, of opportunity costs. And when we talk about opportunity costs in the context of offshore drilling, Mr. Wilson, could you explain a little bit about what I might be referencing in that regard?
I hate to try to get in anyone's mind, but what I can tell you is that to the extent we are not producing it in the Gulf, somebody else is producing it. We have one atmosphere. An emission that occurs in Australia or Asia is no different than an emission that occurs in the U.S. We produce our oil and natural gas in the Gulf in a manner that is cleaner than anybody else in the world. And it seems like the last place we should begin, if we're worried about emissions reductions, is U.S. oil and natural gas production.
Mr. Cheslin, did we see a decrease in domestic energy use in the last 4 years?
Domestic energy use, no.
Okay. Did we see a decrease in domestic energy production?
It has increased.
Okay.
Yes.
But our demand for energy is increasing essentially every day, isn't it?
Absolutely, and having a certainty in the process. Again, it was mentioned before, if we don't continue to lease lands and explore for oil and natural gas in other areas of the Gulf of Mexico, production will begin to decrease.
And we'll have to get it from somewhere else, won't we?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
Representative Hageman, we will be ruling on your point of order. The